Everybody who tells the Yahoo story starts in the same place. A dinner, 2002. Terry Semel, the CEO of Yahoo, sitting across the table from two Stanford dropouts named Larry and Sergey. They want $1 billion for their little search engine. Semel says fine. A few days later they come back and say, actually, we want $3 billion. Semel walks. That search engine was Google. Today it's worth over $2 trillion, 2,000 billion. And so the story gets told, over and over, on YouTube, in business school case studies, in that one LinkedIn post your uncle shared. Yahoo's biggest mistake was saying no to Google. I'm going to tell you why that's wrong. Not wrong like it didn't happen, it happened, but wrong as an explanation. Because if you think Yahoo died at that dinner table in 2002, you've mistaken a symptom for the disease. Yahoo didn't collapse because Terry Semel made one bad call over dinner. Yahoo collapsed because the company had already decided, years earlier, what kind of business it was, and it picked wrong. Everything after that, including the Google dinner, including the missed Facebook deal, including the 7 CEOs in 11 years, was just that original mistake playing out on a bigger and bigger stage. So today, we're going back further than the dinner. We're going back to a dorm room, because that's where this actually starts, and that's where you'll actually find the real reason Yahoo fell, the reason nobody puts in the headline. In 1994, two Stanford PhD students, Jerry Yang and David Philo, were supposed to be writing their dissertations. Instead, they were doing what bored grad students with fast internet access did back then. They were bookmarking cool websites, just for themselves at first. A running list. They called it Jerry and David's Guide to the World Wide Web, which is, respectfully, one of the worst names in the history of technology. But it worked. By the end of that year, this glorified list of links was pulling in over 1 million hits a month, and Stanford, whose servers were quietly buckling under the weight of two guys' side project, told them, politely but firmly, to get it off campus. So they renamed it Yahoo. They raised money from Sequoia Capital, one of the most legendary venture funds in Silicon Valley history. Then Masayoshi Son, the founder of SoftBank, walked in and put over $100 million on the table for a third of the company. In 1995, Jerry and David dropped out of Stanford for good. Here's the detail that matters, and it's easy to skip past because it sounds like trivia. Yahoo was a directory, a list, a guide to the web, curated and organized by humans, that helped you find things that other people had built. It was not a search engine in the way we'd come to understand that term. It was not infrastructure. It was, at its core, an editorial product, closer to a phone book or a magazine's best of the web column than to what Google would eventually become. Keep that word in your head. Editorial. We're going to come back to it, because it's the seed of everything. In 1996, with fewer than 50 employees, Yahoo went public. The stock opened at $13. By the end of the first day, it had more than doubled to 33. Wall Street looked at this 50-person link directory and said, this is worth $850 million. And this is where the first crack forms. So early, so quietly, that almost nobody at the time thought to worry about it. The market didn't value Yahoo like a media company. It valued Yahoo like a technology company, like the next Microsoft. And Yahoo, flush with cash and a soaring stock price, didn't correct that impression. Why would they? It was working. But a company's stock price doesn't determine what a company is. Yahoo was being paid like a tech company while operating like a media company. And that mismatch is the whole story. Everything else, the CEOs, the missed acquisitions, the strategic flailing, is just that mismatch working its way out over 20 years, like a slow-motion structural failure in a building that was rated for the wrong kind of load. By the late 90s, if you were online, you were probably touching Yahoo in some way, and probably more than once a day. Yahoo Mail was the biggest email service on Earth. GeoCities, which Yahoo bought, let ordinary people build their own janky personal websites, complete with auto-playing MIDI files and animated under-construction GIFs. Yahoo Finance was where you went to watch your .com stocks go vertical in real time, which, in 1999, was practically a national pastime. Yahoo wasn't a website, it was the front door to the entire internet. And the business model was elegant in its simplicity. Get eyeballs, sell ads. Specifically, banner ads, the roadside billboard, ported directly onto a web page. In 1999, that model generated Yahoo $588 million in revenue. For a company that started as a bored grad student's bookmark list 5 years earlier, that is an absolutely staggering number. And here's a detail that I think is the most quietly damning fact in this entire story, and almost nobody brings it up. Starting in 2000, Yahoo outsourced its search function to a small company most people hadn't heard of yet, Google. Think about what that actually means. Yahoo, the self-described front door to the internet, looked at search, arguably the single most important function the internet would ever have, and said, "That's not really our thing, let's hand it to somebody else." For 4 years, from 2000 to 2004, every single Yahoo user who typed a query into that search box was quietly being trained to trust Google's results. Yahoo was, in effect, running a multi-year advertising campaign for the company that would eventually eat it alive, and paying for the privilege. That's not a mistake you make if you think of yourself as a technology company. That's a mistake you make if, deep down, you think of yourself as a media portal and search is just a feature you bolt on, like a weather widget. On January 3rd, 2000, at the absolute peak of the dot-com bubble, Yahoo's stock market valuation hit $125 billion. For context, that's more than Ford, GM, and Chrysler combined. A 5-year-old link directory was, on paper, worth more than the entire American auto industry. 2 months later, the Nasdaq peaked at just over 5,000 points. Within 2 years, it would lose 78% of its value, and Yahoo's stock went down with it, from nearly $120 a share to barely above single digits. By 2001, Yahoo stock was down 93% in a little over a year. I want to be fair here, because it's easy to make this sound like Yahoo-specific incompetence, and it wasn't, entirely. The dot-com crash wiped out an enormous chunk of the internet economy. A huge amount of Yahoo's ad revenue in the late 90s had come from other venture-funded startups, companies like Pets.com, who were spending investor money on banner ads to chase eyeballs, with no actual path to profit. When the venture money dried up, those companies stopped buying ads, and Yahoo's revenue cratered along with everyone else's. So the crash wasn't Yahoo's fault. But here's the thing worth sitting with. Jerry Yang and David Filo, the founders, watched their combined stake go from $22 billion down to under $1 billion, and David Filo, who had co-founded the company, who had dropped out of his PhD program for this, never sold a single share. Not during the boom, not during the crash. He believed in the thing he'd built enough to ride it all the way down. I bring that up because it's important to remember there were real people with real conviction inside this story. This isn't a tale about a faceless corporation making dumb moves. It's a tale about specific, often talented, often well-intentioned humans operating inside a company whose fundamental self-identity was quietly wrong, and paying for that mismatch in ways they couldn't see coming. The CEO during the crash, Tim Kugel, ironically rhyming with the company that was about to become Yahoo's biggest problem, watched revenue collapse and eventually stepped aside. And this is where the board made a decision that, on paper, looked like exactly the kind of bold move a struggling company needs. It just happened to be bold in precisely the wrong direction. The board brought in Terry Semel. Semel had spent nearly a quarter-century running Warner Brothers. He greenlit Batman. He greenlit Lethal Weapon. He was, by any measure, an extraordinarily successful executive, just not in technology. He was a Hollywood media guy, through and through, and the board was so eager to land him that they handed him $110 million in stock options simply for showing up. And here's the part that complicates the popular version of this story. Semel was, by the numbers, initially a massive success. He took Yahoo's revenue from under $1 billion to $6.4 billion in 6 years, a 9-fold increase. He rebuilt the sales organization using the exact playbook that had worked for him his whole career, the big media playbook: bundle content, sell premium ad packages, lean on brand relationships. It worked. Genuinely, dramatically, worked. But watch what's happening underneath those numbers. Semel wasn't fixing Yahoo's identity problem. He was doubling down on it. He was hired because the board, consciously or not, still saw Yahoo as a media company that happened to live on the internet. And so they hired a media guy to run it. And the media guy did what media guys do. He optimized the media business. Beautifully. Just not the business that was about to determine who won the internet for the next 2 decades. Which brings us back to that dinner. When Larry and Sergey sat down across from Semel and asked for $1 billion, and then $3 billion a few days later, you have to understand, Yahoo itself was only worth about $5 billion at the time. Buying Google for $3 billion wouldn't have been an acquisition. It would have been close to a merger of equals, and Semel would have had to convince a public board that the right move was to bet a majority of the company's value on a search engine, a category Yahoo had already outsourced because it didn't think that deeply about it. And remember, none of the things that would eventually make Google a trillion-dollar company existed yet. No AdWords, no Gmail, no cloud infrastructure business. Google in 2002 was, from the outside, a genuinely excellent search engine, and not obviously anything more than that. Semel wasn't an idiot. He was a media executive, evaluating a search company, using media executive judgment. And search companies don't look like good media bets. They look like plumbing. This is the part everyone gets wrong. The popular story says Yahoo's fall began at that dinner table. The truth is, the dinner table was just the moment the identity mismatch became visible from the outside. Yahoo said no to Google not because Terry Semel was foolish, but because Yahoo, as an organization, had never actually decided it was a technology company that needed to own the technology of finding things. It had decided, back in 1994, that it was a curated guide to the internet, an editorial product, and every leader after that, including a very talented one, was operating inside that inherited identity, whether they realized it or not. Semel did try to catch up, to be fair to him. Yahoo spent over $1 billion acquiring a company called Overture, and another $250 million on a search technology company called Inktomi. In the abstract, decent moves. In practice, it didn't matter. Google's lead was already too large, and in technology, unlike media, a large enough lead in the right infrastructure tends to compound rather than close. Google went public in 2004 at a valuation of $23 billion, which at the time felt enormous. Today, it's worth over $2 trillion. And then, in 2006, it happened again. The board authorized Semel to spend up to $1.2 billion to acquire a small social network run by a Harvard dropout named Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg wanted $1 billion. Semmel offered $850 million. They couldn't close the gap, and the deal died over $150 million. Pocket change, in hindsight, for a company that would go public 6 years later at a $104 billion valuation. Added up, Google and Facebook, combined, could plausibly have been Yahoo's for something like $3 or $4 billion total. Today, those two companies alone are worth more than $3 trillion combined. That is not a rounding error. That is the largest missed opportunity in the history of business. And it happened twice, to the same company, under the same leadership philosophy, in the space of 4 years. But I want to stop you from drawing the lazy conclusion here, which is Semmel should have just said yes both times, because that's hindsight talking, and hindsight is cheap. The real failure wasn't failing to predict the future value of two specific companies. The real failure was that Yahoo had no internal mechanism, no cultural instinct, for recognizing when something outside its comfort zone. Search infrastructure, a nascent social graph, might be more important to its future than anything inside its comfort zone. A technology company built by technologists might have made the same financial calculation and still found a way to say yes, because owning the infrastructure of finding things and connecting people would have registered as existential, not optional. Yahoo, run on media instincts, treated both as interesting bolt-on features it could take or leave. That's the mismatch. That's the actual disease. The dinner was just the first time it showed symptoms in public. Here's the wild part. People inside. Yahoo saw the mismatch clearly. In 2006, an executive named Brad Garlinghouse wrote an internal memo that became known as the Peanut Butter Manifesto. His argument was simple and, in hindsight, devastatingly correct. Yahoo was spreading itself across too many priorities, too thin, like peanut butter scraped over too much bread. It wasn't failing because it lacked talent or ambition. It was failing because it refused to choose what it actually was. The memo leaked to the press. It became one of the most cited strategy documents in tech history. Business schools still reference it. And the board's response? Essentially nothing changed. The company kept doing what it had always done, adding more properties, more content verticals, more features, chasing every corner of the internet at once, because that's what a media portal does. It aggregates. It doesn't say no. Saying no is a technology company's instinct, born from the discipline of engineering resource constraints. Yahoo never developed that instinct, because it never fully believed it needed one. Ironically, the clearest strategic vision in this entire era came from the same guys who'd built the original, flawed identity. In 2005, co-founder Jerry Yang personally championed a $1 billion investment for 40% of a scrappy Chinese e-commerce company called Alibaba. When Alibaba eventually went public in 2014, the largest IPO in history at the time, that single billion-dollar bet had returned something like 3,500%. For a while, it was genuinely bizarre, because Western investors had trouble accessing Chinese stock directly. Some people bought Yahoo stock purely as a backdoor way to own a piece of Alibaba. The core Yahoo business had become almost incidental, a wrapper around someone else's success story. Which tells you everything. The most valuable decision in Yahoo's history from 2005 onward wasn't a Yahoo product decision at all. It was a founder placing a bet on someone else's technology company, in a country most Silicon Valley executives weren't paying attention to yet. Meanwhile, the core ad business, the thing Semmel had spent 6 years building, peaked at $7.2 billion in revenue and then began sliding, down to $4.5 billion by 2012, as Google and the rising Facebook ate the display advertising market alive. And here's where the identity crisis stops being philosophical and starts becoming almost farcical. Between 2006 and 2017, Yahoo churned through 7 different CEOs in 11 years. 7. Read that list and you can watch the board's confusion play out in real time, like they were trying every possible answer to a question they'd never actually defined. Semmel got pushed out in 2007, replaced by co-founder Jerry Yang himself. An emotional, understandable choice, since this was, quite literally, his life's work, built in a dorm room over a decade earlier. Just months later, in February 2008, Microsoft's Steve Ballmer put a staggering $44.6 billion offer on the table to buy the entire company, a massive premium over what the market said Yahoo was worth. Yang said no. Ballmer came back with $47.5 billion. Yang said no again. You can understand the emotion. This was his baby. And Yahoo owned that Alibaba stake, which everyone suspected was going to be worth an enormous amount someday. But the market didn't share his optimism about Yahoo's core business. When Microsoft withdrew the offer in May 2008, the stock dropped 15% in a single day, erasing $6 billion of value in an afternoon. Activist investor Carl Icahn launched a proxy fight. Shareholders sued. It was chaos, and Yang didn't survive it. In came Carol Bartz from Autodesk, an enterprise software executive. Another mismatch. Another attempt to import discipline from an entirely different kind of company. She lasted a couple of years before the board fired her. She found out via email and resigned to the entire company the same way, firing back a farewell note on her way out the door. Then came Scott Thompson, poached from PayPal, who lasted less than a year before it emerged he'd fabricated a computer science degree on his resume. A different era, certainly. It's hard to imagine that alone ending a CEO's tenure today, but it tells you something about how thin the credibility margin had become. There was no room left for a scandal, even a strange, almost avoidable one. An interim CEO, Ross Levinson, filled the gap. And then, in 2012, the board made its most on-the-nose hire yet. Marissa Mayer, 37 years old, employee number 20 at Google. If you wanted a single human being to embody the fantasy of what if Yahoo had been a technology company all along, it was her. Mayer's strategy was acquisition at scale, $2.3 billion deployed across more than 50 companies, an attempt to buy her way into relevance. The centerpiece was a $1.1 billion purchase of Tumblr in 2013. Remember that name. It's going to matter again in a minute. For the first 14 months of her tenure, Yahoo's stock doubled. It felt, briefly, like vindication, like the Google instincts really were the missing ingredient. But look closer at why. The stock doubled. It wasn't Yahoo's operating business. It was the Alibaba stake, quietly appreciating in the background, doing the heavy lifting it had been doing for years. The core business Mayer was actually running hadn't turned around. It was being propped up by a bet her predecessor's predecessor had made almost a decade earlier. And Tumblr, the flagship of her acquisition strategy, turned out to have a problem nobody had fully accounted for. A significant portion of its content and traffic was adult material, which made it a difficult platform to monetize the way Yahoo needed. Within a couple of years, Yahoo wrote down $712 million of that acquisition's value, essentially admitting they'd overpaid. When it finally sold years later, Tumblr went for less than $20 million on a $1.1 billion purchase. That's not a rounding error either. That's a company destroying more than 98% of the value of one of its signature bets, in public, in real time. Then came the breaches. In 2013, hackers, reportedly with ties to Russian state security, compromised essentially every Yahoo account in existence. 3 billion of them. A second breach in 2014 exposed another 500 million accounts. And here's the detail that turns this from a technical failure into a leadership failure. Internal security teams knew. Leadership was aware. And the disclosures didn't happen for years. The 2013 breach wasn't publicly disclosed until 2016, and only then because Yahoo was in the middle of selling itself to Verizon, and the truth was about to come out anyway during due diligence. Verizon cut $350 million off the purchase price once it did. The final sale price, $4.5 billion. For a company that, 16 years earlier, had been worth $125 billion. Marissa Mayer left with $239 million in compensation over her tenure and a $23 million severance package. The company's general counsel, who had presumably carried real responsibility around the breach disclosures, resigned with no severance at all. Verizon merged Yahoo with AOL, another aging internet pioneer it had acquired, into a new division called Oath. It didn't work. Verizon eventually wrote down $4.6 billion on the whole experiment. The Alibaba and Yahoo Japan stakes, the actual source of most of Yahoo's remaining value for over a decade, were spun off separately into a company called Altaba, worth tens of billions of dollars on its own, finally severed from the operating business that had, for years, just been riding on its coattails. In 2021, a private equity firm called Apollo, which specializes in acquiring distressed and end-of-life assets, bought what remained of the Yahoo business from Verizon for $5 billion. And here's a strange coda. The brand didn't disappear. Yahoo Mail, Yahoo Finance, and a handful of other properties still exist today, still used by hundreds of millions of people. Old internet infrastructure, it turns out, dies slower than you'd expect, the same way people still use AOL dial-up email addresses decades after AOL itself stopped mattering. A brand can outlive the company that built it by a very long time. So here's where I want to pull back and answer the question this whole video is built around. The popular story says Yahoo's downfall was a decision, specifically the decision to walk away from Google in 2002. It's a clean, dramatic, quotable story, and I understand why it's the one that gets repeated. It has a villain, a single moment, a satisfying if only, but it's the wrong story, because it treats a 20-year organizational failure as if it were a single afternoon of bad judgment. If Terry Semel had said yes to that $3 billion Google offer, does Yahoo's story actually change? Maybe for a while. But the underlying company, the one that outsourced search because it didn't think that deeply about infrastructure, the one that hired a Hollywood executive because the board still thought of itself as a media company, the one that read the Peanut Butter Manifesto and changed nothing, the one that cycled through 7 CEOs in 11 years because it could never agree on what business it was actually in, that company was going to produce a crisis eventually, with or without Google. Maybe it looks different, maybe it's 5 years later, or with a different rival, but the disease doesn't go away because you dodge one symptom. The real origin of Yahoo's fall isn't a dinner in 2002. It's a decision that was never consciously made back in 1994 and 1996. The decision about what kind of company Yahoo actually was. Nobody sat down and chose, we are a media company, not a technology company. It just sort of happened, by default, because that's what the product was at the time. A curated directory, an editorial guide, and nobody ever revisited that choice as the internet around them fundamentally changed shape. The company kept the identity it was born with, long after the world it was built for had disappeared. And once you see it that way, the rest of the story stops looking like a series of unrelated blunders and starts looking like one long, consistent symptom. Outsourcing search to Google in 2000. That's a media company's instinct. Content is the product. Infrastructure is a vendor relationship. Hiring Terry Semel. That's a board reaching for the leadership profile that matches the identity it already believed in. Saying no to Google and Facebook? That's an executive applying media industry math to a technology industry opportunity and getting the wrong answer because he was using the wrong ruler. The Peanut Butter Manifesto going nowhere? That's an organization that structurally couldn't say no to anything because saying no requires a clear sense of what you are, and Yahoo never had one. Even the acquisition spree under Marissa Mayer, someone who by background should have understood the technology instinct better than anyone, was really just the media portal reflex wearing a different outfit. Instead of building infrastructure, buy content and traffic. Same DNA, new decade. There's a Steve Jobs line that gets quoted a lot in business circles, and it applies here almost too perfectly. Someone once asked him how he decided what Apple should build next, expecting some grand framework. His answer, more or less, was that figuring out what to work on isn't actually the hard part. Any capable team can generate a list of good ideas. The hard part is having the discipline to say no to almost all of them and to focus obsessively on doing a small number of things extremely well. Yahoo never developed that discipline because it never had the underlying clarity that discipline requires. You can't have the courage to kill an initiative if you've never decided what your company actually is at its core. Every initiative looks equally justifiable, equally worth keeping, equally part of the portal. A directory can hold infinite links. A company can't hold infinite priorities. Yahoo tried to run itself like the first thing while competing in a world that demanded the second. That's the true origin of Yahoo's fall. Not a dinner, not a single missed acquisition. An identity that was set almost by accident in a Stanford dorm room, never revisited, never chosen on purpose, and a company that spent 2 decades and $120 billion in lost value finding out the hard way that what are we actually is the first question any company has to answer, and one of the only questions you don't get to keep avoiding forever. If you're building something right now, a company, a team, even just a project, that question is worth asking on purpose, today, instead of letting the market ask it for you in 20 years. If you want more deep dives like this one, let me know which company you want to see next in the comments. I read every one, and honestly, the requests are what decide what I make next. Catch you in the next video.